Reed Smoot was elected to the United States Senate in 1902. No voter ever saw his name on a ballot. Reed Smoot was elected to the Senate the old-fashioned way, the way the founders thought senators should be elected. The state legislature chose and voted for Reed Smoot to go to the United States Senate to represent the state of Utah. In his 30-year career as a senator, Reed Smoot rose to the most powerful chairmanship in the Senate, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, with jurisdiction over the federal government's two ways of raising revenue, bringing money into the Treasury: taxation and tariffs. With the stock market crashing in 1929 and the country entering the Great Depression, Reed Smoot had the worst idea any chairman of the Senate Finance Committee ever had. It was an idea that would end his career in the Senate. The House Ways and Means Committee had the same jurisdiction in the House that the Finance Committee has in the Senate: taxation and tariffs. The chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Willis Hawley, loved Reed Smoot's very bad idea. That idea also ended Chairman Hawley's career in the House of Representatives. In 1930, with the country sinking deeper into an economic depression, Chairman Smoot and Chairman Hawley pushed the Tariff Act of 1930 through their committees. And then they both got it passed in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. And by the time it reached the president's desk for signature, it had come to be known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. It raised tariffs astronomically, higher than ever before, on thousands of goods. It was exactly what Donald Trump is now proposing as a presidential candidate. Economics was a much less complex field of scholarship in 1930 than it is today. The analytical tools available to economists were far fewer and very unsophisticated compared to today. But even then, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were something economists could agree on. Over 1,000 economists signed a petition to President Herbert Hoover, Republican President Herbert Hoover, asking him to veto the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. America's most famous industrialist at the time, Henry Ford, knew it would be a disaster for business and a disaster for the economy. He went to the White House to try to convince the Republican President Herbert Hoover to veto the tariff bill written by Republican Senator Reed Smoot and Republican Congressman Willis Hawley, and passed with overwhelming Republican support in the House and the Senate. Henry Ford called the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, quote, an economic stupidity. J.P. Morgan's chief executive said, quote, I almost went down on my knees to beg Herbert Hoover to veto the asinine Smoot-Hawley tariff. Herbert Hoover, a successful businessman in his own right, thought he knew better. And he signed these Smoot-Hawley tariffs into law. And in the next election, Herbert Hoover lost his re-election campaign for the presidency to the governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In that same election in 1932, when voters were living with the disaster of Reed Smoot's bright idea and Willis Hawley's eager support of that idea, Senator Smoot and Congressman Hawley lost their re-election campaigns. There is universal agreement among economists that Smoot-Hawley tariffs made the Great Depression even worse. Those tariffs did not protect American jobs. They killed American jobs. And it meant that the portrait of Willis Hawley hanging in the offices of the House Ways and Means Committee, along with the portraits of all the other chairmen of that committee, and the portrait of Reed Smoot hanging in the offices of the Senate Finance Committee, along with the portraits of all the other chairmen of that committee, it meant that those portraits hang forever in disgrace and infamy. Smoot and Hawley hurt America more than any other chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee in history. They destroyed lives. People lost their homes, lost their jobs, lost their hope because of what Senator Smoot and Congressman Hawley did when they did not have any idea what they were doing. Just like Donald Trump. And so when you hear economists now saying Donald Trump's idea about tariffs is even worse than Smoot and Hawley, you have to know something about Smoot and Hawley to really understand just how bad Donald Trump's idea is. Henry Ford would have to reach for a new rhetorical extreme to describe it, because Henry Ford's phrase, an economic stupidity, would feel inadequate. Last week, Donald Trump said he wants to eliminate the tax code, eliminate the personal income tax and the corporate income tax, and replace the income tax with nothing but tariffs. Donald Trump wants to eliminate the income tax, replace the revenue to the government with nothing but tariffs, the biggest tariffs in American history. CNBC reports Donald Trump on Thursday brought up the idea of imposing an all-tariff policy that would ultimately enable the U.S. to get rid of the income tax, sources in a private meeting with the Republican presidential candidate told CNBC. Every Trump supporter who attends Trump's rallies believes Donald Trump's big lie when he says this.
Nobody ever took money out of China like me. I took hundreds of billions of dollars out in the form of tariffs and taxes.
Nope, he didn't take a penny from China, not one penny. It is reasonable to assume that most Trump voters believe that China pays the tariffs imposed by Donald Trump, because Donald Trump says that China pays the tariffs. But in high school, they should have learned, and maybe before high school for a lot of students, they should have learned that tariffs are paid by the people in the country that imposes the tariffs. That's how tariffs work. You don't have to take advanced placement American history in high school to learn about tariffs, including these Smoot-Hawley tariffs. Donald Trump knows that China does not pay the tariffs that he imposed. He knows that American consumers pay those tariffs. They function as sales taxes on American consumers. And Donald Trump is consciously lying when he says that to his audience about China paying the tariffs. And because American consumers pay the tariffs, in effect as sales taxes, an increase in tariffs means an increase in prices through, in effect, sales taxes, which is the very definition of inflation, that increase in prices that Donald Trump's tariffs would bring about. Donald Trump is proposing the single most inflationary idea of our lifetimes. And that is just one aspect of the pain Donald Trump would inflict with this idea, which Harvard economist Lawrence Summers, who was the first to raise concerns about possible inflation during the COVID-19 pandemic, says is the worst economic policy proposal in U.S. history. In U.S. history. And Larry Summers knows economic U.S. history. And that means that Donald Trump's idea is worse than Smoot-Hawley, much worse.
Replacing the income tax with revenue with tariff would be the worst macroeconomic policy proposal in U.S. history. It, of course, burdens the middle class and the poor who purchase goods that exist on international markets. So it's regressive, as many economic commentators have suggested. But that is actually the least of it. Think about it this way. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which did enormous damage, some people would say made the Depression great, we're 0.6% of GDP. If you replaced half of income tax revenues, not all like he talked about, if you replaced half of income tax revenues with tariffs, those would be tariffs 6 times Smoot-Hawley levels. That's got the potential to do enormous damage to the competitiveness of every U.S. exporter, to do huge damage to all kinds of workers who use imported goods in what their businesses produce, to create a downward spiral as much higher prices for everything we import means consumers have less to spend on everything else, create worldwide economic warfare as the rest of the world responds. This is a prescription for the mother of all stagflations.
Stagflation is a not so easily achieved economic condition of stagnant economic growth, no economic growth, combined with high inflation and high unemployment all at the same time. We have not seen stagflation in this country in the 21st century. But Donald Trump is now running to make stagflation great again. We meet on this subject in sadness, because we are always, it might not be fully apparent to others, but mourning what the Senate used to be, the Senate that we lost, where we could easily respect the positions of Republicans who were opposed to our views in legislative engagement on the Senate floor and sometimes come out with a compromise solution, sometimes not. But never think that we were up against a force that was trying to either destroy the Senate or harm the country in any way.
Well, thank you, Lawrence, for having me. And of course, you and I go back in the Senate and we look at the Senate and the long decline of it with sadness. On the other hand, I was interested in updating the book to find that in 2022, for instance, the Senate actually came up with quite a few bipartisan accomplishments. President Biden and Senate Leader Schumer unified the Democrats for the most part, and then were able to find a dozen or 15 Republicans for the first gun safety legislation in a long time, the Marriage Equality Act, the CHIPS and Science Act. I think the Republicans, to some extent, wanted to make up for their catastrophic failure in failing to stop Donald Trump. So the Senate, with Democratic leadership and control, can actually accomplish some things, which makes this election cycle so critically important to keep the Senate majority, which is now hanging by a thread.
Yeah, and so that's what's at stake in every one of these elections, whether, you might not think your particular Senate race in your state matters very much to you, but control of the Senate, who's going to be the chairman, who's going to run these committees, who's going to be in control of the way it works, which party, that's just night and day.
You know, it wasn't always that way. Mm-hmm. We had shifts in the Senate. If you go back in 1980 or 86, control shifted, and yet the Senate tended to function either way because the senators had a concept of what the Senate was about. They knew how to do the business of the Senate. But as we've become a more polarized country, and in recent years, the control of the Senate is an absolutely critical imperative. We had the Biden administration and the Schumer majority Senate, which contrasted so dramatically from the McConnell-controlled Senate, which failed the country and gave us the extreme Supreme Court majority that has imperiled our rights on a continuing basis.
You have a quote that I had actually forgotten in this edition from Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who I worked for, where he makes the point. He said, in the next century, America is going to have to consider how the representation pattern in the Senate, the 2 per state, and how that has turned out in a way that the founders could not have imagined, with a state the size of California having 2 and each Dakota having 2. And so that people are wildly overrepresented in the Senate from some states, wildly underrepresented in the Senate from other states. Such that now you pointed out that, that there's about 9 states where you have almost a majority of the country represented by only 18 senators.
The Senate's legitimacy hangs on that. The notion that California has only two senators, one Wyoming has 2 senators, offends our concept, and yet it's baked into the Constitution. What was the solution to that in practical terms? In practical terms, it was that so many excellent senators came from small states, and they proved to be, whether it was South Dakota or Vermont, all over the country, small state senators, Montana, like Mike Mansfield, proved to be great senators. And as a consequence, the Senate operated, and we weren't so conscious of the disparities in population. But when the Senate breaks down, then the inequity of California having 2 senators and as opposed to Wyoming having 2, that's striking to us. And
you have a proposal in the book for having at-large senators, a group of senators, 15 maybe, who are elected nationally.
Well, that is my idea, and I'd like people to think about it at some point. Fundamental change in the Senate is probably years off. But I thought if you elected 15 senators nationally, these national senators would have a different sense of their responsibilities. They would upgrade the Senate overall. And I think they would encourage the other 100 senators to think about their commitments to the national interest, as opposed to simply being representatives of their state or party members. The Senate's deteriorated quite a bit because the senators have become fundamentally partisan operatives. Many of the Republican senators particularly became partisan operatives as opposed to people who were looking at the national interest.
When we get to the other side of this election, we have to talk about Ira Shapiro's reform of the Senate ideas. The book is The Betrayal: How Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans Abandoned America. Ira Shapiro, thank you very much for joining us once again tonight.
Thank you, Lawrence. Good to be with you.
Thank you.